I grew up in the Midwest. I remember going to church and I'd be slapped by my mom half because I said, "Mom, what's that?" The older women would wear a black little thing to cover their necks because they had goiters. Because the Midwest source of salt was, at the early days, was not iodized. Because glaciers had moved through there and cleaned all that out, so the soils for the things that are grown in them, as well as any salt that was taken from the area where it could be found, local salt deposits, is rare, lacked iodine. Iodine is what the thyroid gland thrives on, and that regulates all kinds of growth in the placenta and the embryo and everything else from mom, and energy levels it determines, all those sorts of things. And this entire village had huge amounts of these kids, and backward and retarded kids, due to that particular thing. There's another element that's often missing in soils, and that's molybdenum, for example. So this is around the world. This just gives you one thing about the importance of soils or this abiotic. Molybdenum, incidentally, is important for plants in the soil, for plants to develop vitamin C when they're growing. They need molybdenum to develop at the end product, the plant you eat, and make vitamin C. So those kinds of stories can go on and on, back and forth. We talked. This is where we'll be hanging out a lot, of course, on predators, vectors, and pathogens. Okay. Let me just finish something that I clipped out the other day. Was that rat worship in India still continues in certain places. They do not remove them from temples, and they're meditating, and they're just all over the place, as are monkeys, and both of which are excellent vectors for different types of pathogens. The main one we're going to be talking about Tuesday, both of you two girls lead the sections of that. And then I was also reading about the mosquito. I mentioned it briefly the other time. It's a particular species of mosquito that arrived and is a perfect carrier for bone break disease, bone break fever, dengue. This arrived in 1985 with a shipment of tires, recycled tire from Japan to the U.S. And shortly after that, it's now all in the ecosystem in the U.S. Before that, we didn't have this particular mosquito called a tiger mosquito. But it's now producing, and Texas has it, dengue, maintaining it and stuff. But, so those are all kinds of trafficking that it isn't only in people carrying it, but it's all the other things that you see very quickly when we talk about the plague in more detail. Okay, enough said on the model, unless somebody has something particular you want to point out on it.
Not necessarily point out, but I have a question.
Okay.
Like, you heard the term of depleted uranium babies. Is that considered a disease?
What is it?
Depleted uranium? Like,
Okay.
Depleted uranium babies, that's just what they call them, I guess. But it's when, like, the survivors of the nuclear bombs, when they go ahead and, grow up and have children and such, the children are coming out with no skin, no eyelids, such like that. Is that considered a disease, or what would that be considered? Because
Well, it certainly is dis-ease.
Yeah.
But it's obviously passed down through the genetic damage.
Yeah, because
And that, some of that genetic damage can keep on getting passed down. You get a chromosome there, maybe at one end, but if it's recessive, it probably won't show up in those next generations, but then it can be combined, of course, in simple Mendelian genetics. If you get a damaged system in there, it probably passes on that way. Yeah. This whole radioactivity stuff is something indeed to be concerned with. Joe.
Yeah, I sort of had a question too.
Sure.
It's a lot different.
How about all of us?
But
try to answer.
Well, since we're talking about genetics,
Okay.
I want to know what makes it different for like a human disease versus animals, like a that has certain diseases that only animals can get, certain only we can get.
There are some of this gal over here, Sarah, can add to this certainly, but pathogens, particularly infectious pathogens, have certain habits, as we know with this various forms of influenza. Some, the last big scare, stage 5N1, was in birds, and it killed off how many chickens in Asia, a few years back. But it had not, as far as I know, I don't stay up on every one of these dimensions, but had not passed. Humans got it by dealing with chicken, but it was not able to take, if you want to say, in humans where it could be passed to another human, thank goodness.
Oh.
So there are very great specificity often among pathogens of where they have long-term association. We ourselves have tremendous amount of microbes in our guts. Many of them over time have become commensals, as we call it. They help support us. They make vitamin K. There are all kinds of things in there. So that's part of the answer. Sometimes when they will pathogen or different microbes, when you get other kind of diseases, like for example, a lot of people dying, what we think from AIDS, originally particularly anyway, didn't die from AIDS, but it weakened their immune system so much. But these other things very quickly came in.
Right.
Pneumonia. Pneumonic waves came in and took advantage of that. Some that already had it. That's the truth about probably multiple sclerosis, that many people might have this lurking. It certainly is in the case of something I had after 40-some years or more of having chicken pox. I developed about 2 or 3 years ago. I woke up one morning and started scratching, and I thought, well, we live in this old house because our main house up in Alaska, we just got a small old house. Basement, there's a lot of spiders, and I thought, crap came through the wall, up the floor somewhere, and I got bit by mosquitoes. I scratched, it was kind of red here. And then I noticed it was moving over towards my eye. And so, shingles. But different form, this chickenpox virus had hid out in one of the 2 or 3 main hiding places. My brother-in-law had it, and with age and sometimes stress, you changed the whole system where it came out of hibernation, so to speak, was laying there and traveled along the optic nerve. So luckily I got there in time. He checked it, gave me some tickling medicine, so it didn't make me blind. But that's the other thing. Things can exist at different states, and depending on the host, it can become alive and deadly and under different kind of conditions. But by and large, the answer is that there's a good deal of specificity, particularly infectious agent. But over time, some become, as I said the other day, more powerful, more virulent forms survive if, remember that point the other day? These are kind of things I'm reviewing because it helps keep it in mind that I talked about. If they have a new way of hitchhiking or transmitting, in other words, mobility. So my example was cholera in Latin America. Because of the lack of hygiene and sanitary systems, it can just downright make you sick, and within 5 days of having first symptom, you're dead. And it can do that because that would be against leaving very many prodigies to make you that kind of sick quick, and then what happens? It dies out, and it didn't make sense to brain, but to the whole thing, and all of nature is leaving progeny, That's what we measure by fitness in humans and other mammals, and it's the true same in pathogens. But the only reason it could return in that version of many, many varieties become that virulent because it had a new mechanism for transmitting, and that was working on the gut, diarrhea, clothing, sheets, whatever could make contact and continue its way that way. So if somebody laying flat on their back, if they've got a mosquito or other ways to get around, it's even their advantage because, swatting mosquitoes and if they're in the right kind of environment is not an easy thing to get them all, and particularly housing and that sort of thing. And times of activity. Some mosquitoes are active more in the evening, at night, hanging in those little walls up there. Some are more active during the day. Some pathogens are more subject to destruction very easily. Tuberculosis lasts for quite a while, but we know that ultraviolet radiation kills it. So hence the old TB asylums, which was always putting people in sunny places, and some of that problem certainly helped beyond getting better nutrition and care and staying warm and helping their own host internal system. So a long-winded answer, but that's a good part of it. This is quickly to look at, and you do not, to look at our past a little bit. Health profile of typical hunters and gatherers. These are some things you really should know. When you get out of this class, you ought to know these. They're real basic about infectious disease. The following four things help offer and did in the past, and a few hunters and gatherers that still mostly live by hunting and gathering, still are protected to a large extent from infectious diseases by these four things. First of all, for epidemiology, group size is small. Generally, with some exceptions, which are listed down below, we go into a little more detail there, but you don't need to know that. But in my neck of the woods, some of these groups that lived under hunting and gathering, they had such a rich environment. We are finding settlements in the Aleutians that are huge, way different than we ever thought we'd find hunters and gatherers living. And that's because they got 2 or 3 salmon runs that you could literally almost walk across their backs. I have been in the backcountry with some salmon runs yet in some places that's just so thick you really feel you could just walk over that stream on the backs of these salmon. So they smoked them and every other way dried them to prepare. But they also had other things, all kinds of birds, you know. It was a pristine environment. So some of that under group size